History has shown us that the U.S. military intervention has not always been successful as it claims to be, and the outcomes of intervention tend to have a negative effect on the world. It is time for the United States to pull back on intervening with other nations' conflicts. In the early days of U.S. military intervention, the U.S. would intervene because it felt threatened or because another nation had invited them to assist in the battle. If we look at wars like World War I and II, the U.S. intervened because in both events our nation was being threatened. The U.S. joined World War I on account that Germany was participating in unrestricted submarine warfare, which sunk several American merchant ships. The reason for entering World War II was for the clear threat imposed by Japan with the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Although in World War I and II, intervention clearly proved to work, that unfortunately has not been the case for many other nations. In the American mindset, which tends toward mindless optimism, bad is logically replaced by good. If we look at Cold War, it is clear to see that the U.S. intervened with selfish interest. The United States saw communism as a threat and decided to enter the Cold War. However, by entering the Cold War, the U.S. was not accomplishing much. The U.S. used the communist regime that the Soviet Union was pursuing as an excuse to enter the war. However, this did not play an actual threat towards the U.S., and in this case, intervention was absolutely not needed. The same goes for the war in Vietnam. The U.S. entered this war with the optimistic idea that they would act as a savior for the Vietnamese people. On the contrary, this war once again proved that intervention was not needed at all, and by intervening, the U.S. actually made it much worse. Over 3 million people were killed in the Vietnam War, including 58,000 Americans. Unfortunately, not much came from the Vietnam War. As soon as U.S. troops fled, the North Vietnamese continued plotting to overtake South Vietnam. The U.S. failed to notice that Vietnam was in the midst of a civil war, and both sides were plagued by corruption and leaders intent on maintaining control of the population. Moving forward into modern days, we can see the pattern of intervention has not ended. The U.S. continues to place itself into conflicts that do not call for aid of the United States. Deposing oppressive regimes sometimes leads to greater oppression. For years, the United States has used oppressive regimes like communism as an excuse to intervene. However, by doing so, they often prop up dictators or illegitimate regimes that result in the collapse of a nation. It is with good intent that the U.S. wants to intervene, but there must be an understanding that Americans cannot liberate populations by crashing into or tearing apart foreign countries. We can look at Libya and Sudan as great modern-day examples of how U.S. intervention has unfortunately torn apart these countries. Bombing Libya and promoting the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi seemed like a fine idea, but no one back in Washington seemed to have asked the obvious question of what would follow his collapse. Libya had little civil society and no democratic tradition. It should have been obvious that the terror and civil war would break out if Gaddafi were suddenly removed. The U.S. intervened in Libya to save lives, but because we had no substitute for the regime we deposed, in the end our intervention killed more than it saved. A similar situation occurred in Sudan. Many well-meaning humanitarians in the United States were moved by stories about the brutality of Sudan's leaders, Omar al-Bashir, that they promoted a process to cut the country into two. The idea was the new country of South Sudan would be a refuge for peace and democracy. Instead, it has become a killing field. Tens of thousands have died since independence in 2011, and 2 million people have lost their home and adrift among warring armies. Intervention in both of these nations failed because there was no plan set in place for what happens after these countries gain independence. By failing these nations through intervention, we do not only create more of a problem for them internally, but also externally. Both of these nations now have a refugee crisis, and it is in the hands of countries like the U.S. to find a solution. So by intervening, Not only do we create more of a problem for these nations, but for ourselves as well. Many times dealing with unpleasant regimes, rather than fighting them, can have long-term benefits. It is never a good idea to attack, destabilize, or seek to dispose a government based on the vague hope that a better one will follow.